Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The sun was a hammer, and the anvil was the scorched grass of the plains. For most in the small settlement of Providence, it was a season of labor and cautious optimism. The harvest promised to be fair, the creek had not yet run dry, and the log cabins, hewn from the dark pines of the hills, stood as solid testaments to their defiance of the wilderness. For Silas, it was a season of exile. He was 16 years old. His sentence had been delivered not by a judge with a gavel, but by a council of elders in the town's only church, their faces grim and certain in the flickering lamplight. His crime was one of unfortunate circumstance and poor timing. A fence improperly mended. A prize bull wandered onto the wrong pasture. A fight between neighbors that had simmered for a generation and needed only a spark. Silas, the orphan boy who kept to himself and spoke with the faint, clipped accent of the flatlands his parents had come from, was that spark. He was an easy sacrifice. He was banished, not from the territory, for they had no such authority, but from the community. He was to live outside the town's protection, barred from the general store, the blacksmith, and the communal well. He was given a plot of land a mile out, a parcel no one had ever wanted. It was a wind-swept knob of earth, notable only for its complete and utter lack of trees. He stood on that plot now, the deed, a piece of paper already yellowing in the sun, clutched in his hand. He was a ghost in his own life. The people of Providence, when they rode past on the main track, would look straight through him, their faces set like stone. He was a liability, a loose thread they had snipped from the fabric of their society. They expected him to fail. They expected him to drift away before the first frost, or to be found, come spring, as a set of bones picked clean by coyotes. It was a quiet, brutal form of execution. Silas, however, was not looking at the horizon for an escape. He was looking at the ground. He knelt, pulling a stalk of blue-stem grass. It was long, thick-stemmed, and tough as wire. It was the only crop this worthless land seemed capable of producing in abundance. To the ranchers and farmers of Providence, it was forage, feed for the animals that would see them through the winter. To Silas, it was something else entirely. It was his salvation. In the small, tattered satchel that was his only inheritance, he carried two things of value. The first was a worn, leather-bound journal, filled with his father's meticulous, spidery script. The second was the memory of his father's hands. His father had been a quiet man, a farmer from the sandhills of Nebraska, a place even more treeless than this. He had been a man obsessed with the natural architecture of the world. He wrote of the way prairie dogs built their towns to channel the wind, of the insulating properties of a deep snowpack, of the sod houses built by the first settlers on the plains. But he had been working on a different idea when the fever took him and his wife, leaving Silas alone at the age of 10. The journal was filled with sketches and calculations, all centered on a single, radical premise. What if you could build a house not from the earth itself, but from the skin of the earth, from the grass? The idea was born of a treeless necessity. His father had written, "Men in the East build with what is plentiful. They have forests, so they build with wood. They have quarries, so they build with stone. Here, on the plains, we are given one great gift in abundance: grass. We are meant to build with it. They call it a soddy, a house of dirt. But the dirt is just the binder. The strength, the warmth, is in the roots, in the tightly woven thatch of a million stalks. The sod house is a house of grass, held together by earth. What if we could bypass the dirt? What if we could build with the grass alone?" Silas had read those pages 100 times. He understood the principle. You harvest the grass, let it cure in the sun, and then compress it. Compress it with immense force into dense, hard-sided bales, like giant bricks of solidified sunshine. You stack them like stones, bind them, and then coat them in a plaster made of mud and lime. It was a house of hay. He spent the rest of August and all of September with a scythe. The work was brutal, a swinging, rhythmic agony that became a form of meditation. He cut the tall prairie grass, laid it in windrows to dry, and turned it daily. He was a lone figure on his hill, a boy performing a strange, pointless ritual. The townspeople saw him. They would slow their wagons, point, and whisper. They saw a boy cutting hay with no livestock to feed it to. It confirmed everything they believed about him, that he was foolish, unmoored, and touched by a grief that had curdled his sense. Next, he built the press. It was a crude, powerful machine, hewn from scavenged driftwood and the remains of a broken-down wagon he found in a gully. It was a simple lever and plank design, based on a sketch in his father's journal. It was slow, back-breaking work. Each bale required him to stop the hay into the chamber, then throw his entire weight against the long lever arm, again and again, until the grass compressed into a block so dense he could barely lift it. By the time the first cold winds of October began to scour the hills, he had 150 of them. Golden, sweet-smelling bricks, each one roughly 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches thick. They were stacked in a neat, monolithic rectangle near the foundation he had dug. The foundation was nothing more than a shallow trench filled with rocks, a rubble footing to lift the first course of bales off the damp earth. Upon this, he began to lay his strange bricks. He staggered the joints, just as a bricklayer would, pinning each bale to the one below it with sharpened wooden stakes he had painstakingly carved. The walls rose slowly, a course a day. They were thick, almost 2 feet deep, and they looked utterly absurd. It was a house with walls of animal fodder. The mockery was no longer whispered. It became direct. The first to confront him was Elias Thorne. Thorne was the town's master carpenter, a man whose authority was as solid and unquestionable as the log cabins he built. He was a pillar of the community, a man who believed in the immutable logic of axe and timber, of notch and joint. He rode out to Silas's hill one afternoon, his face a mask of civic concern that barely concealed his professional disgust. "Boy," Thorne said, dismounting. He didn't wait for a reply. "What is this folly?" Silas looked up from his work. He was placing a bale on the top course, his young body wiry and hard from the labor. "It's my home, Mr. Thorne." Thorne gestured at the golden walls with a thick, calloused hand. "This is not a home. This is a mouse hotel. It's a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The first rain will turn it to mush. The first snow will collapse it. You're digging your own grave, son. A coffin of rotting hay." Silas paused, his eyes calm. He ran a hand over the coarse texture of a bale. "It won't rot." "It won't rot?" Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. "It's hay. That's what hay does. It gets wet, it mildews, it rots from the inside out. I've seen it happen to 1,000 haystacks. You'll be living inside a pile of compost before Christmas." Silas shook his head, a gesture of quiet certainty that infuriated the carpenter. "A haystack is meant to shed water from the top. These walls will be sealed, and they need to breathe." "Breathe?" Thorne scoffed. "A house needs to be tight. It needs to hold the heat in and keep the wind out. My houses," he said, puffing his chest out slightly, "are built on that principle. Tight logs, good chinking. That's how a man survives a Dakota winter, not by living in a breathing pile of grass." Silas simply looked at him. He did not argue. He did not defend. He just held the older man's gaze with an unnerving placidness. "The heat is in the grass, Mr. Thorne, and it won't rot if the moisture has a way out." Thorne stared at the boy, at the absurd, fragrant walls. He saw not ingenuity, but madness. The boy's grief had unhinged him. He was a liability, just as they'd all said. Thorn mounted his horse, his duty done. "Don't come crawling to us when this thing falls down on your head. The community has washed its hands of you. This proves our wisdom." He rode off, leaving Silas alone with the scent of cut grass and the vast, indifferent sky. He was not wrong. That was the consensus. The boy was building his own tomb. But Silas knew what Elias Thorn and the others could not comprehend. They saw a pile of grass. Silas saw a sophisticated thermal engine. The narrative of survival on the frontier was written in wood, a story of fighting the cold with fire. The bigger the fire, the better the cabin. The more wood you could cut and burn, the higher your status. It was a war of attrition against the cold. Silas's father had proposed a different path. Not a war, but a partnership. Not fighting the cold, but managing it. His journal was not a carpenter's manual. It was a physicist's textbook disguised as a farmer's diary. The action of the story pauses here, for it is in the quiet, unobserved principles of Silas's work that the true drama lies. What Thorn and the townspeople saw as folly was, in fact, a masterclass in thermal dynamics. They lived in a world of brute force. Silas was building a world of elegant efficiency. The first principle was insulation, a concept the log cabin builders understood only in its most rudimentary form. They measured a wall's worth by its thickness and solidity. A 12-inch log was better than a 6-inch log. They were not wrong, but they were profoundly inefficient. The measure of a material's ability to resist heat flow is its R value. A solid log wall, 12 inches thick, has an R value of roughly 8 to 12, depending on the wood and the quality of the chinking between the logs. It's better than a canvas tent, but not by much. It meant that the heat generated by a fire would pass through the wooden walls with astonishing speed. To stay warm in a log cabin was to be in a constant state of heat production, feeding a ravenous stove that was fighting a losing battle against the physics of heat loss. Silas's straw bale walls were 22 inches thick. Straw, which is essentially a collection of hollow tubes, is incredibly effective at trapping air. Trapped air is the secret to almost all insulation. The tightly compressed bales in Silas's walls created millions upon millions of tiny air pockets. The R value of those walls was somewhere between R40 and R50. That is 5 times the insulating power of Thorn's best log cabin. It was a number so far beyond their experience as to be meaningless. It meant that once the inside of the house was warm, it would stay warm for a very long time. The walls didn't just resist the cold, they held the warmth in a gentle, persistent embrace. The second principle was thermal mass. This was a more subtle concept. While insulation resists the transfer of heat, mass absorbs it. A log cabin has very little thermal mass in its walls relative to its poor insulation. The heat goes right through. Silas's house was different. Once he plastered the walls, inside and out, with a thick 2-inch layer of earthen plaster, a mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw, he would be creating a thermal battery. The dense, heavy plaster would absorb the heat from his small stove or even from the low winter sun streaming through the south-facing window he planned to install. It would soak up that energy all day long, and then, as the temperature dropped at night, it would slowly, gently radiate that heat back into the living space. A log cabin was cold the moment the fire went out. Silas's house would still be releasing the day's warmth long after the embers had died. This combination of high R-value insulation and high thermal mass was a revolution. It meant the difference between a shelter that was a constant energy drain and a shelter that was a passive, self-regulating system. A log cabin was a bucket with a hole in it. You had to keep pouring in water, heat, just to keep it from being empty. Silas's house was a thermos jug. Once filled, it stayed warm with minimal effort. But it was the third principle that addressed Thorne's confident prediction of rot. This was the genius his father had stumbled upon. The principle was vapor permeability, or what Silas had simply called breathing. Thorne was right. If you trap moisture in a bale of straw, it will rot. This is why modern houses are wrapped in plastic vapor barriers. But those barriers are a new invention. The old way, the natural way, was to let the walls breathe. The earthen plaster Silas was mixing was not waterproof. It was porous. When moisture from inside the house, from cooking, from breathing, migrated into the straw walls, it didn't get trapped. It continued its journey outward, passing through the straw and the plaster and evaporating into the dry winter air outside. The wall was in a constant, invisible state of drying itself out. It was a living membrane, managing moisture as skillfully as the skin on an animal. A log cabin, with its tar and moss chinking, tried to create a perfect seal, which inevitably failed. Water would get in through a tiny crack, become trapped behind the impermeable log, and begin the slow work of rot. Thorne's battle against moisture was a futile attempt at a perfect seal. Silas's method was to accept the presence of moisture and simply give it a clear path to escape. He wasn't building a barrier, he was building a lung. The town saw a house of grass. The universe saw a high-performance envelope. The town saw a fool-tempting fate. Physics saw a perfectly rational solution. By the time November arrived, bringing with it a cold, hard frost that stiffened the land, Silas's house was complete. It was small, just one room, but it was solid. The walls were a pale, earthy brown, plastered smooth and thick. A small, efficient cast-iron stove sat in the corner, its pipe rising through a carefully protected opening in the sod roof. He had a bed, a small table, and a single south-facing window scavenged from the same wagon as his press. It looked humble, almost subterranean. From a distance, it resembled not a house, but a natural feature of the landscape, a burrow. The mockery from the town had faded into a quiet, pitying consensus. They were simply waiting for the inevitable collapse. The first snows came in late November, a gentle dusting. December was cold, but clear. Silas was comfortable. His small stove required only a handful of wood to keep the single room at a steady, pleasant temperature. He could sit at his table and read his father's journal without a coat, a luxury the townsfolk, huddled around their roaring fires, could not afford. He spent his days trapping small game and gathering the last of the season's edible roots. He was surviving. More than that, he was comfortable. He was proving his father's theories correct, one quiet, warm evening at a time. The winter held its breath through Christmas and into the new year. Then, on January 12th, 1888, the sky changed. The day had been unseasonably mild, a false spring that melted the existing snow and coaxed some of the more optimistic townsfolk into shedding their heavy coats. But in the late afternoon, a wall of black cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon, and the temperature began to plummet. It did not drop. It fell, as if pushed off a cliff. Within an hour, it had fallen 50 degrees. The wind, which had been a mild breeze, became a physical entity, a screaming, solid force that picked up the newly melted snow and blasted it sideways. This was not a snowstorm. It was a blizzard, a maelstrom of ice and wind that would later be given a name, the school children's blizzard, for the catastrophe it would cause across the plains. In the town of Providence, panic set in. The suddenness of the storm had caught everyone off guard. Woodpiles that had seemed adequate for a normal winter were suddenly terrifyingly small. Elias Thorne, in his expertly crafted cabin, felt the first tendrils of real fear. The wind was a living thing, clawing at his work. It found every tiny, imperceptible gap in the chinking and screamed through it, a high, thin whistle of invading cold. Frost began to form on the nailheads inside his own home. He stuffed the stove with oak, and the fire roared, but the heat seemed to extend only 5 feet from the iron box. Beyond that circle, the room was frigid. His wife and 2 small children were huddled under a pile of blankets on their bed, their breath pluming in the air. The house was not a sanctuary, it was a battleground, and the battle was being lost. Throughout the town it was the same story. The sound of axes echoed unnaturally between the gusts of wind as men began to break up furniture, fence posts, anything that would burn. The conventional wisdom, the time-honored methods of log and fire, were failing. The cold was a predator, and their sturdy log cabins were proving to be little more than wooden cages, offering the illusion of shelter, but no real defense. The wind howled, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero, and the fine, flour-like snow blasted into every crack, creating drifts that buried windows and piled up against doors. The world was reduced to a roaring, white chaos. A mile away, on his lonely hill, Silas sat at his table. The blizzard was not a scream here. It was a deep, resonant hum, the sound of a distant ocean. The thick, plastered walls absorbed the fury of the wind, deadening it to a murmur. There were no drafts, not a single one. The small fire in his stove purred contentedly, consuming a single, small log every 2 hours. The air inside was warm, not hot. It was a stable, even warmth that filled the entire space. He had cooked a rabbit stew earlier, and the smell still lingered pleasantly. He placed his hand against the interior wall. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. It felt neutral, solid, like the earth itself. It was the feeling of immense, quiet strength. He was not just surviving the storm. He was ignoring it. The house his father had dreamed of, the house the town had mocked, was performing its function perfectly. It was a tiny island of calm in the heart of a hurricane of cold. He banked the fire for the night, confident that the thermal mass of the walls would keep the room from freezing, and went to sleep under a single blanket, lulled by the muffled roar of the storm. The blizzard raged for 2 days. In Providence, the situation grew dire. Several families had run out of wood entirely, and their cabins were now as cold inside as it was outside. Livestock froze to death in their barns. The fear of freezing was a palpable presence in every home. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally began to subside, though the sky remained a bruised, leaden gray, and the temperature was still lethally cold. Elias Thorne stood in his home, a place he had built with his own hands, and felt a despair so profound it was a physical weight. They had burned a chair and the children's toy chest. His wood pile was gone. The last of his logs were in the stove, and they would not last the day. His youngest daughter was coughing, a dry, shallow sound that terrified him. He looked out the frost-caked window toward the hill where the outcast lived. He expected to see nothing. He assumed the boy's foolish house had been blown apart, or that he had frozen long ago. But through a gap in the swirling snow, he saw it. A thin, almost lazy wisp of smoke, rising from the chimney pipe on the strange, earthen mound. It was not the frantic, billowing smoke of a desperate, roaring fire. It was a calm, steady plume, the kind of smoke that spoke of efficiency, of control, of warmth to spare. It was an image that broke him. It shattered his pride, his certainty, his entire understanding of the world. His knowledge, his craft, the traditions of 100 years of frontier building. All of it was useless. That steady, placid column of smoke was a monument to his own failure. In that moment, he was no longer Elias Thorne, master carpenter. He was a father, and his family was freezing. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned and stepped out into the brutal, wind-scoured landscape. The walk to Silas's hill was a journey through a frozen hell. The snow was waist-deep in places, the air so cold it burned his lungs. Every step was a battle. He kept his eyes fixed on that wisp of smoke, a beacon of impossible warmth. When he finally reached the small house, he was near collapse, his beard a solid mask of ice. He saw how the snow had drifted up against the curved walls, not as a threat, but as an added layer of insulation. The house looked like it had grown there. He pounded on the wooden door with a frozen fist. For a moment there was no answer, and a terrible thought struck him. What if the boy had died, and the last log was simply smoldering on its own? Then, the door opened. It was not a blast of heat that hit him, like the angry breath of an overstuffed stove. It was a wave of gentle, silent, pervasive warmth. It was the kind of warmth that felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. Silas stood there, dressed in a simple wool shirt, his face calm. He looked at the ice-caked giant before him, saw the desperation in his eyes, and simply stepped aside. Thorne stumbled in. The silence was the first thing he noticed. The screaming of the wind was gone. The world was utterly still. The warmth enveloped him. He looked at the stove. The fire within was tiny, a bed of glowing coals with one small log resting on top. It made no sense. This little fire was doing what his roaring inferno could not. He looked around the small, neat room. Then, he did what his builder's hands compelled him to do. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the interior wall. It was the moment of his conversion. The wall was not warm. It was not cold. It radiated a faint, deep, living heat. It felt like placing a hand on the flank of a large, sleeping animal. It was the stored energy of the thermal mass, the captured warmth of the past day, breathing back into the room. He understood, in that single, tactile moment, the profound and revolutionary principle at work. He had been fighting the winter. This boy had befriended it. He had built a house that worked with the laws of nature, not against them. His eyes, stinging from the cold and from tears he refused to shed, met Silas's. All the mockery, the warnings, the condescension, it all lay between them in the warm, silent air. Thorne's pride was a heap of ashes at his feet. He was a student in the presence of a master. And the master was a 16-year-old boy his town had thrown away. How? The word was a croak, torn from his frozen throat. It was not just a question. It was a plea. It was an admission. It was an apology. Silas did not smile in triumph. He did not recite the principles of R-value or thermal mass. He saw not the skeptic who had mocked him, but a man in pain. He gestured to the pot of stew simmering on the stove. "My family," Thorne whispered, the words catching in his throat. "We are freezing." Silas nodded. He ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to the carpenter. He added a small piece of wood to the fire. Then he began to explain, simply and quietly, not with the arrogance of a victor, but with the gentle patience of a teacher. He spoke of hollow stalks and trapped air. He spoke of the sun's heat and walls that could remember it. He spoke of letting the walls breathe so they would not rot. That night, Thorne brought his family to Silas's house. The 7 of them slept on the floor of that single small room, bathed in a steady, life-giving warmth. The next day, guided by Silas, Thorn and other men from the town, their own pride frozen and shattered by the storm, dug a tunnel through the snow to their own homes, carrying back the knowledge that would save them. They learned to bank their fires differently, to insulate their windows with blankets, to think not just of heat, but of heat loss. When the great blizzard of 1888 finally broke, the town of Providence was changed forever. They had been humbled. They had been taught a lesson in humility by the landscape itself and by the boy they had cast out. Elias Thorne, the master carpenter, became Silas's first and most devoted student. That spring, Thorne did not cut logs. He helped Silas harvest and bale the prairie grass. Together, they built a second hay bale house, this one for a family whose cabin had been irreparably damaged by the storm. Thorne, the expert in wood, learned the new craft of plaster and bale. He saw that the principles were universal: care, precision, and an understanding of the materials. The methods spread. They were called Silas houses at first, a name spoken with a reverence that erased the memory of it ever being a term of mockery. They were warm in the winter, surprisingly cool in the summer, and so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. They were cheap to build and required no pillaging of the pine forests in the hills. They were, in a word, superior. Silas was no longer an outcast. He was a visionary. He was brought back into the community, not as a prodigal son seeking forgiveness, but as a respected elder, a founder, his youth irrelevant in the face of his profound wisdom. He lived a long and quiet life in his small house on the hill, always teaching, always observing, his father's journal always open on his table. Years later, when a traveler asked him the secret to his designs, Silas pointed not to the walls, but to the prairie outside his window. He retrieved his father's journal and read a passage from a well-worn page. The powerful look at a forest and see shelter. They see strength in the unyielding trunk, in the solid heartwood. They are not wrong. But the wise look at a single blade of grass. They see that its strength is in its flexibility. It bends before the wind, it does not break. Its power is not in its solidity, but in its hollowness. It is built to trap the air and hold the sun. A tree fights the winter, the grass endures it. Fire is not the gift. Heat is the gift, and it is a gift that can be stored in the humblest of things. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction of events that took place across the American plains in the late 19th century. The characters are fictional, and the content presented here does not constitute professional building or survival advice. It is a tale of ingenuity, of looking at the world not for what it is, but for what it could be. The world is full of conventional wisdom, of experts who tell you that your walls will rot, that your ideas are folly. They build with the timber of their own certainty, and they cannot imagine a shelter built from the grass of a new idea. What about you? What overgrown field of forgotten knowledge lies just outside your own town walls? What humble, dismissed material do you hold in your hands that might be the very thing everyone needs to survive the coming storm?